Hey folks, I'm back with another instructive game submitted via our Patreon page. And today we're going to be looking at a really interesting game where I mainly just want to focus on the opening and talk a little bit about opening principles and opening ideas, and also the end game, because the end game in this game was actually quite instructive as well. So this game was submitted by cjang, who's playing white here, and cjang starts off with e4, black plays e6, the French defense, white goes d4, and in their notes, cjang writes, taking the center. This is a thing, right? And yeah, absolutely, cjang. I know when we think about the opening, a lot of players try to focus on finding the right moves or remembering the right moves, but generally speaking, the player who plays well in the opening is not going to be the player that knows more opening moves, rather the player that develops their pieces, fights for the center, and gets their king safe, like the three golden opening principles. And yeah, generally in the first couple of moves, we want to be fighting for the center, and we really want to be fighting for the center with pawns. So whenever we get e4 and d4, and you'll notice against all of black's responses against e4, if black is not playing e5, which controls the d4 square, or c5, which also controls the d4 square. So if black is playing c6 here, or d6, or e6, you'll notice that the main move against all of these openings is d4, just immediately taking the center with pawns. So this works against d6, this also works against c6. In general, when you're playing white, you have the first move, you want to be fighting for the advantage, and part of that consists of fighting for the center. Of course, the big exception is the Alekhine defense with knight f6. Here, black is attacking the pawn on e4, so if we play d4, we're just going to lose that pawn. But note that one of the big main lines here is to advance the pawn to e5, attacking the knight, and then after knight to d5, you can throw in c4 if you want to. I personally don't like to. I think just d4 is simple and strong. Again, just fighting for the center and opening up the way for the rest of white's pieces. So d4, absolutely the right move. Now black plays d5. Here cjang goes knight c3, and then writes developing and not taking on d5. This is correct, right? So now here, correct is a very loaded word. And I wouldn't say that this move is necessarily correct, meaning that it's the only good move. In fact, it's one of several good moves. And this is what makes the opening interesting, is that there's not just one right way to play against every opening. There are many different ways. So knight c3 is a good move. Knight d2 is also a very good move here, defending the pawn and allowing white to play c3 in the future to strengthen the d4 pawn. This is the main idea behind putting the knight on d2 versus on c3, the so-called Tarrasch variation. White can also play e5 on move 3. Grabbing space, this is known as the advanced variation. This one is also considered a very serious approach for white. And in fact, even e takes d5, I would say, is not a bad move. It's definitely not considered the most ambitious move, because after e takes d5, we've allowed black to sort of equalize their share of the center and open up their light squared bishop. But it certainly is a move that people can play. And a lot of people do like this move because it leads to a simple position. White still has the advantage of the first move, so white is still the one fighting for the advantage here. And yeah, if black doesn't play this solidly, then black is not going to get a good position out of the opening. So I would encourage players around cjang's level not to be too dogmatic about the opening. You might learn one move here or there. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be the only move in the position. There are many different ways to play the opening, but the key thing to playing the opening well is to make sure that you're following those opening principles. You're fighting for the center, you're developing your pieces, you're getting your king castled and safe, and you're not breaking a lot of opening principles as well. So things like moving our rook pawns too quickly out of the opening, I think this is not usually a great strategy. Getting the queen out too early, this usually isn't going to be very good. Moving a piece more than once in the opening, moving it multiple times, definitely not good. You want to be playing with all of your pieces, getting all of your forces out. So yeah, definitely lots of good moves here, but knight c3 is certainly one of the best. And now black plays c5, and this is where the game actually gets really interesting, because this move c5 is pretty sharp. Black is just trying to open up the entire center immediately, but this is of course a very risky approach, because black is the one that's behind in development. Now here white plays knight f3, which looks extremely natural. But I just want to point out that in this position, I would say that e takes d5 is actually a very, very reasonable move. And it's a move that a lot of players naturally won't want to make because they're thinking, oh, this is the exchange variation. Exchange variation is not supposed to be very good. Therefore, e takes d5, not a good move. But this is no longer the exchange variation. White has now played knight c3. We're past the point where white can play the exchange variation. This is now just the chess position. And this is where you have to just learn to think on your own and think more about the structure rather than trying to apply so-called opening rules and maybe some opening moves that you have seen before. So why is e takes d5 such a nice move here? Well, the point is that white is trying to open the center because white is the one that is ahead in development, and so this is going to create problems for black. So after the exchange on d5, for example, white can also take on c5 here, and now the d5 pawn is under attack. If black recaptures this one, white can go ahead and just win the pawn on d5, and white has already won a pawn. If queen e7 check, white can comfortably block queen e4, offering a queen trade since we're a pawn up and we're happy to go into the endgame. Now, it's not necessary that white is necessarily going to be winning this pawn on d5, but even if black is able to defend it and recapture on c5, the point is that we're going to be leaving black with an isolated pawn in the center, and this is definitely something that we can eventually target with our pieces. White can play knight f3 here, bishop g5, other bishop can come out to b5, white can castle kingside, and eventually white can put a lot of pressure on this d5 pawn, as long as we're developing our pieces. So e takes d5 here I think is actually a totally excellent move here. After e takes d5, we can also follow up with bishop to b5 check. This is a very common check to give in this kind of position as it just speeds up white's development. And then, for example, after knight c6, knight f3, white is ready to just castle, put a rook on e1. And as soon as this bishop moves, let's say to e7 or d6, that would be the exact right moment to actually trade on c5, forcing black's bishop to make another move. And then we're leaving black with this weak pawn on d5, for example. Let's say knight f6 here, castles, bishop d6 or bishop e7. We can throw in rook e1 check. That looks pretty annoying actually. But just to illustrate the point, now we would take on c5, forcing black's bishop to move again. And now white has great pressure against the pawn on d5, especially with this pinning move, bishop g5, putting massive pressure on the knight on f6. We also have rook e1 in the position. And yeah, this d5 pawn is under heavy pressure because it has no pawns around it to defend the pawn. This pawn has to be defended by black's pieces. So I just wanted to point that out because I notice a lot of players, they end up kind of stunting themselves because they get into this mindset of, oh, I can never play e takes d5, or I can never play this move, or this move is always good. And this is how you kind of develop these bad habits that are probably not great for your overall chess game. In general, I think you should treat every position as kind of a new one. And just because a move might not be good in a previous position doesn't mean that it's not going to be good in the current position. So after c5, white plays knight f3, which doesn't break any opening principles whatsoever, just might not be the most challenging move, but is still okay. Black plays knight c6, and here white goes bishop b5. And in their notes, cjang writes, so is this pin a mistake? This is a habit of mine to restrict the knight's movement on c6. So I guess I need to stop doing this kind of thing. I think bishop b5 is totally fine. It's actually the follow-up where white ends up getting into trouble. Because after black plays a really natural move a6, here is where white needs to just commit to taking on c6. And this would be the big lesson that I would try to give here on this move bishop to b5. If you're going to be pinning the knight, well, then you need a response to a6. And if your response to a6 is not that you're just ready to trade off and hopefully play against black's double pawns, well, then the bishop doesn't really have much to do on b5. Because if black can just kick you away, then it's kind of a loss of time, and black is happy to get this a6 move in with tempo, meaning they didn't have to spend a developing move. They force white to move, and then black can continue developing from there. So cjang runs into problems here because they play bishop a4, which allows black to play b5. And I'm sure we've all been caught in this kind of trap when we were inexperienced chess players. I'm sure I've lost many pieces like this as a kid. White's forced to go bishop to b3, and now black closes it all down with c4 and wins the bishop. And so all of a sudden, white just has big problems in this opening. So like I mentioned, after a6, white really needed to just trade off this bishop. And if that was not the plan, if you don't want to trade off this bishop, well, then we shouldn't be playing bishop b5 in the first place. What should white do? Well, actually, I think taking on d5 was, again, the right move here to force black to take back with the pawn. And the reason, I should really just make this clear, the reason that here it's okay to take on d5, whereas on move 3, the exchange variation, it's considered maybe not the most ambitious move, is because black is already committed to c5, which means we're going to be trading these pawns off as well at some point. And then again, the d5 pawn is going to be left isolated and possibly weak in the future. So that's why e takes d5 in this kind of position, in this kind of structure, actually makes a lot of sense. And here I think bishop b5 is actually a very reasonable move. But again, after a6, the idea would be to just trade on c6, leave black with these weak pawns on the queen side, simply castle, and I think white's position is very pleasant. We have a nice lead in development, all of our pieces are out. Black is many moves away from castling kingside. Castling queenside is not really a serious option here because it's too vulnerable and weak. And yeah, I think white just continues rook e1, bishop g5, for example, and gets nice lead in development here and a good position. So after bishop b5, we end up getting our bishop trapped. And surprisingly, cjang doesn't actually lose this game, although at this point, the position is definitely lost. Black is winning a piece, and this is going to be decisive material advantage. So let me continue through the game because I actually just want to get quickly to the end game where we have another series of critical moments. Here, white tries to fight on. I would say the one thing about this kind of position when you're down a piece is generally we want to avoid trading. We don't really normally want to let our opponent simplify the position by getting lots of pieces off the board, because if white has any chances to get back here, it's going to be with the pieces that we have. A simple analogy I like to use that I think works really well is if you're playing soccer or you have a fight between two groups of people, you would rather have 4 versus 5, meaning you're down one person, than play something like 2 versus 1. Right? If you take a soccer game, if you take 4 skilled soccer players, they're gonna possibly outplay 5 players, right? But if it's 2 versus 1, that's a lot harder to overcome for your individual players. That's why when we have an advantage in pieces on the board, generally the side that is ahead wants to trade down and kind of grow their advantage. 2 versus 1 is better than having 4 versus 3 or 8 versus 7 and so on. So here white kind of, I think, doesn't quite play it correctly. Knight a2, castles bishop to e3. I think we don't really want to be trading pieces here. Instead, I'm not exactly sure what the idea was behind knight a2. I think the knight should just stay in the center. Maybe something like bishop g5 would have been more active, followed by rook a d1, and just trying to put a little bit of pressure on black in the center, though of course black is still doing really well. So knight a2, bishop e3 again. I don't think we should be trying to trade pieces here when we're down material. Queen d6, queen g3, once again, more trading. This is not really what we want to do in this kind of position. And now, actually cjang writes, I realize that I'm trading off pieces during this whole period of time where I perceive that I'm being attacked. After discussion with my opponent, I guess I shouldn't be trading if I'm down material, ? Yes, to answer your question, right, when we're down material, we want to keep more forces on the board. This is what gives us more chances to get back in the game, usually. But let's see what happens in this game. So white keeps fighting, and black keeps improving their position as well. Rook d2, a5, knight d3, bishop f5. And I would say that black plays very reasonably in this game. Goes bishop takes d3, just trying to simplify getting more pieces off the board. It is good that white got the rook to e7. Now white can potentially try to fight for some counterplay on the 7th rank. And yeah, the game actually gets very interesting. Black goes rook c1 check, king h2, and now rook to d5. hoping to play rook h5 mate. Now white is able to defend this one, and in fact cjang finds, I think, very good move here, g4, luring the knight to take on g4 so that the king can have a little bit more room, and who knows, maybe black will forget about the back rank. Of course, this doesn't happen. Instead, black first plays king to f8, but now white backs it up, rook e2. Now black gets scared of a possible rook e8 checkmate and plays rook to d8. And here white plays rook a7, which definitely the best move in the position because white is opening up the second rook to get to the 7th rank. And this is an idea that comes up a lot in the endgame. I think a very, very important one to take away from this video. 2 rooks on the 7th rank, very, very powerful construction. They support each other, they threaten to take all the pawns on the 7th rank, and they can create some mating threats against the enemy king. And they're not always so easy to defend against, and so we'll see some interesting 2 rooks on the 7th positions in this game. So black takes on g4, king g3, f5. Now I don't like f5 here because black is actually exposing the 7th rank, and after rook e7, all of a sudden now white has serious counterplay and a lot of threats. White wants to go rook f7 check and is already threatening to give a perpetual in the position. The g7 pawn is hanging as well. And yeah, this is actually all of a sudden tricky for black to defend. What I would suggest instead of f5 is maybe h5. I think to defend the knight in a more solid way. And on rook e7, black can defend f7 with a move like knight h6. Just a very compact move. f7 is now covered. White's rooks no longer have any threats, and now black can just use the active rook on the c-file and start picking up all of white's pawns. And the knight on h6 certainly looks bad, and we've all heard, hopefully, this maxim, knight on the rim is dim, but notice that the knight is defending a pawn being attacked by 2 rooks. So when we think about the economy of forces here, this knight on h6 is actually doing a great job because it's holding off 10 points of material, right? 2 rooks on this f7 pawn, the knight is holding it all on its own, and white's rooks just have nothing to do, and this frees up black's rooks to go and do whatever they would like. Start capturing pawns in white's position, going after white's king with rook d1, etc., and white is just out of counterplay. So this, I think, would have been just the most solid way for black to win this game. Instead, we get some drama. f5, rook e7. Now I think black doesn't exactly realize the danger here and plays rook to c2. At this point, black really needed to defend, so either a move like knight h6 here, hoping to cover the f7 square, though here already it's not as clear after white goes rook takes g7 and threatens to take on h7 next move. Instead, I think the most solid defense probably would have been this move, knight f6. And this doesn't defend the g7 pawn either, but what it does do is defend the h7 pawn. So if white goes rook f7 check, for example, and rook takes g7 check, black can hide the king on h8, and there's actually nothing white can really do here. If white tries to go after the knight, note that the knight is not really hanging, because if white takes, then the rook on g7 is going to be hanging. So white can get to this position, but then there's no follow-up from here. h7 is defended, and once again, the knight is holding off the 2 rooks. Black's rooks are now free to do whatever they would like. Rook g8 is a possibility here to trade off, or black can again just go after white's pawns. So instead, black goes rook to c2. And this now allows white to start giving checks on the 7th rank. So rook f7 check, king g8, white takes this one, king h8, and already here, white can give a perpetual. We can take on h7 with check, and there's no way for black to get out of these checks. And at this point, I gotta say, if I'm playing white, I am very happy with the perpetual because we're down a piece, we're totally losing all else considered, but this perpetual check is actually a saving grace. So we really should have just repeated the position at this point, and this is why they call it a perpetual, because black simply has no way out here. There's just no way to get out of the checks. Okay, this is actually a horrible blunder. We can even checkmate here. Make sure to watch out for this one. But yeah, black's king has to stay on g8, rook g7, and yeah, no way for the king to escape the checks. You can also do it with the other rook. The 2 rooks are defending each other. There's nothing the king can do. Just has to keep trying to get out of check. and white can just give checks for the rest of time here. And so the game should be a draw. Instead, what happened was white played the move rook a f7. And in their notes, cjang writes, I am unsure as to why this is a blunder. Is it because it's not forcing? So that's kind of it. Yeah, so this move is not really a check. And so it gives black a chance to possibly defend their position. Now, it's not easy to defend at this point because white is still threatening a perpetual. The rook takes h7, followed by rook to g7, and the king can't get out of the checks. But black does have actually a really nice way to defend here. If you guys would like, as an exercise, I encourage you to pause the video. Try to find the best move for black. How can black actually defend against white's threats? Well, once again, black had this option to play the really nice move, knight f6. A hard move to find because it's tactical, right? You have to see that the knight cannot be taken as the rook on g7 is hanging. And so this knight is indirectly defended, and defending h7, white's main threat. This was the only way to defend the h7 pawn and the only way to actually win the game for black, or at least keep a winning advantage. I should note that the move rook to g8 would not work in view of rook takes h7 mate. So yeah, this move is basically too slow, and this gave black a chance to play knight f6 and defend everything. But okay, black misses this one, doesn't see how to defend h7, takes on f2. And now actually I noted an interesting opportunity here. White could play the move rook takes g4, winning a piece because the rook on f2 is going to be undefended. Maybe black throws in rook takes g2 check, king takes g2, f takes g4, and black is a couple pawns up, so I'm not sure if white has enough here. Maybe some compensation, but I strongly doubt that white is better. Instead, white takes on h7, which I think is correct, king g8, and once again, white can just give the same perpetual check. And immediately, white can just force a draw. Once again, I think this would be the right thing to do. Instead, we go rook f g7 check. We're still forcing a draw here, king f8, rook f7 check. And in fact, maybe this one is a little bit better than using the h rook, because here white actually gives black a chance to mess up, which black does do with the move king to e8. And at this point, the game actually does get drawn by repetition. The player simply repeats a bunch of times, and the game is a draw. But actually, after king to e8, white did have a chance to win the game, which is unexpected. Normally, two rooks on their own is not enough to give mate. A lot of times they need help. But here, if you like to pause and try to find the best move for white, a winning move, feel free to do so. I think this is another good exercise. Well, white could have played the move rook a7 here, or rook b7. And the point is that now, since white's rooks are stretched far apart, the king on e8 is actually stuck on the back rank, and this threat of rook h8 is actually impossible to deal with. And so black is just getting mated here by force. Rook h8 check and mate, right? The knight can come back to f6, but this doesn't save anyone after the check anyway, and white is mating. So a bit of a missed opportunity, a bit of a shame, because this would have just won the game on the spot. Shows the importance of doing lots of tactics so you can kind of build up your experience, understanding, and intuition for positions where the king might be in trouble, you have some active pieces, and we want to look for these mating ideas. Actually a very nice puzzle, because rook a7 is kind of a quiet move, it's not a check, but after this move, black is simply lost, has to play something like maybe rook to d7 and give up the rook to avoid checkmate, but this one is just going to be totally game over. White takes the rook, and next move can come back with rook h7, again stretching black's king, and now there's going to be too many mate threats in the position. So yeah, quite an unfortunate missed win, but hopefully a very instructive one. As I mentioned, the game instead just ended in a draw by perpetual. So yeah, guys, I hope you found that instructive. These positions with two rooks on the 7th, they come up in a lot of endgames, and it's actually a very good plan to play for when you have two rooks in the position, to just try to get your two rooks on the 7th rank, because if you can get them coordinated and they start taking stuff, they can be very dangerous, they can create mate threats, and a lot of times they can even win you the game a piece down. So pretty incredible pair of rooks here. I also hope that the opening discussion was useful as well. And quick note for cjang and everyone else that are just starting out in terms of annotating their games, you know, this project on Patreon is something that we're doing to kind of encourage people to get into the habit of annotating their games and really thinking through their decisions and their moves. One suggestion I would make for everyone doing this is to include some variations when you're annotating the game. So one useful thing is to kind of write down your thoughts, what you were thinking and at what point, why you made a certain move, what you were kind of playing for. But as you analyze the game, it's also very, very important to consider different options and actually inputting them as variations into the notes. So, instead of a certain move, you could say, oh, maybe I could have tried this, and then just try to analyze it a little bit on your own. How do you think the game would have continued from there? What do you think the opponent would have done? And do you like that position? Do you like that change of events? So annotating the game is often about considering different options that you could have played, inputting them into the notes, and then evaluating them. Maybe it's better than what you played. Maybe it's not as good. Maybe during the game you thought a certain other move was good. Then you analyze it afterwards and you realize, oh, actually this move would not be good. I could be, maybe it's a blunder or maybe losing material in some way. So the point is to consider different variations after the game, try to put some kind of evaluation on them, and then submit that game. And then when I look through your notes and your evaluations and your variations, I can kind of get a better sense of whether you're understanding the position, whether you're going to improve for next time, or if there's still something missing from our thoughts that should be expressed. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you found it useful. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.